It's good to have you here. And my name is Stephen Fetter. I am a minister in Toronto, and I also manage the United Learning Program for the General Council. So it is a pleasure and an honor to be with you today and to have a chance to connect with clergy and lay leaders, church leaders from across the nation as we think our way into all of the changes and issues that we're facing in this remarkable and strange time. Want to invite my colleagues to introduce themselves, but even before I do that, let me say to those of you who are watching on Zoom, on YouTube, you're welcome to watch us on YouTube, but we're kind of hoping to have a conversation. And it would be easier if you could be with us in Zoom, because YouTube runs about 30 seconds behind us here in the Zoom room. So you'll see the connection instructions are there to scroll up to the top of the chat. And if you can join us in Zoom, we'd be delighted to welcome you. Right now, we've got loads of room in the Zoom room here. We can accommodate up to 300, and there's 43 of us here right now. So come join us and be part of the conversation. Today's event is really not a bunch of experts presenting information. Today's presentation program is more like cross-country checkup. I think it's an opportunity for all of us together to noodle through where we're at and where we're going and where the church needs to be and what does it mean to be church in the middle of this complicated time. So we hope that you will interact with us. We hope that you'll leave your cameras off because it's distracting to have too many cameras on. But we'd like you to use the chat, and that'll be your primary way to interact with us. So in order to find the chat, move your mouse over our pictures, and you'll see the Zoom menu comes up at the bottom of your Zoom window. Click the button that says chat. It should open the chat for you, and then you type right down at the bottom where it says type message here. And when you push enter, then your comment is posted for everyone to see. Right above that, there's a spot that says everyone, or to everyone. And as long as the button says everyone, then your note is going to go to everyone and we can all see it. You have the chance though to send a private message. So if you want to send a private message to me or to Joe or to Catherine or to a friend online, then you can click that button, choose the person that you want to send it to and type your message there. Just remember that next time you want to send a message to everybody, you go back and change the button again. It doesn't default back to everyone once you've changed it. So use the chat, interact with us. We'd be delighted to have you with us. I'm just thinking we should open with lighting the candle. Let me get the candle that I have been lighting in all of my worship services, and we'll just take a moment to remember that we are gathered not just as friends and not just as colleagues, but as church leaders, as people who have this awesome and sometimes frightening responsibility to shepherd the church through important times. And my goodness, this is one of those. So as we gather, I invite you just to take a moment to pause, to remember and then let go of all the worries of the day, to remember and then let go of all of the things that aren't done yet, and to remember and give thanks that we are gathered in the light of Christ. We are not alone. We live in God's world. It is God who names us and warms our hearts and lights our path. And we invite God to be with us in the midst of this. And I'm just going to put this off beside me so that if I get excited, I don't knock it by mistake. Not that that would ever happen, but there's a YouTube video of somebody else doing that, and it's scary. Before we jump into program and conversation and kind of set the ground rules and all of that, let me invite my colleagues to introduce themselves. So Catherine, who are you and why are you here and what are you bringing into this today?
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. It's fun to work with Steve always, and I haven't been able to work with Joe for a few years, so I'm just really pleased to be in this group and to be thinking about how we are church in this strange and unusual and very difficult time. I've been serving St. Paul's United Church in Edmonton since the early aughts, and I've been in ministry for 35 years. I've had the privilege of serving churches right across the country and being part of organizational things and the thinking of the church, the praying of the church, the reflecting of the church across the denomination. I think most recently the events I'd like you to know about are the Revitalize events, where leaders in the church and outside the church come and speak about what has caught their passion recently, and we will be presenting in Halifax next spring. I've been working on preparing the big questions with John Young, and then we've worked with Steve Fetter to come up with some different big questions in the church that we can be working our way through to make our ministry more solid, more reflective, and our congregations more lively. I also have the pleasure coming up of being part of the Sing 2025 group, and I'm on the Ethos Education Justice subunit, and Sing 2025 will be our new music resource. It will be ready, we think, in 5 years, which will be the celebration of the centenary of the United Church of Canada. So pretty fun, pretty exciting stuff. And I expect you'll all be engaged in that in a variety of ways as this 5-year task rolls forward. So I'm happy to be here today and looking forward to our time. Thanks.
Yeah, delighted, and thank you. Thank you for agreeing to be part of this on such a busy weekend. Joe, introduce yourself if you please.
I'm Joe Ramsey. I live in a little town called Napanee, between Toronto and Montreal, just outside of Kingston, Ontario. And I was ordained in 1984 and was in ministry for a number of years in pastoral ministry, and then served as a conference staff person, a personnel minister, and worked in the general council office for 12, 13 years. In the ministry and employment unit, and worked primarily in the area of pastoral relations and human resources. And then in 2015, I started just doing independent consulting with churches, particularly around hosting large, wide conversations with congregations to help them reimagine themselves and their God's call to them and their future together as communities of faith. And that has been lots of fun and been very interesting. Working also with Adam Hanley in the General Council office, supporting the United Fresh Start program, which is a program that I helped adapt for the United Church when I was in the General Council office. It's primarily an educational program that looks at some of the major themes of being the church and managing church, and issues of leadership and conflict and those kinds of issues, and getting lay leaders and ministry personnel on the same page as much as that is possible around some of those issues. That's the primary point of the program, is to develop a healthy pastoral relationship based on these common knowledge and common conversations. And that's been really interesting as well. It's kind of a bit of a hiatus right now because folks' attention is on other things, not only in these recent couple of months, but even prior to that with the restructuring of the church and so on. But we continue to hold that program and support those couple hundred facilitators across the country, throughout the country, that have been giving leadership to that program. So that's been fun. And more recently, I'm at Edith Rankin Memorial United Church part-time, 25 hours a week, working in a congregational setting while trying to hold some of these other pieces in place. That's what I'm doing these days, Steve.
Yeah, and when do you sleep, Joe? It's so exciting to work with the two of you, and you know, the conversations that we had on Tuesday as we planned this were wonderful. I've been thinking about them ever since, so I'm kind of excited to dive into this. Let me just offer a little bit of a preface, and then the two of you may have some things you want to add to that. I was realizing as I've been offering these webinars now and hosting these webinars for a couple of weeks around the pandemic, that we've been spending an enormous amount of time and energy, and rightly so, in trying to make sure that the church doesn't go belly up, and trying to make sure that the church is able to function. And we've talked about finances, and we've talked about programming ideas, and we've talked about how to connect with parishioners, and an awful lot of it has been kind of in panic mode around, oh my goodness, things are going awful, we need to rescue it. And that makes sense to me. We need to pivot quickly. And as church leaders, we are charged with caring for the institution in ways that our parishioners aren't. So yeah, that makes sense. And yet, we are not called primarily to be institutional leaders. We are called to be disciples, and we are called to lead communities of disciples. So after leading webinars of 1,000 church treasurers who are panicking about how to pay the bills, I wanted to have an opportunity to talk together as pastors about what does it mean to be faithful disciples in this time. How do we get beyond the panic? How do we get beyond the programmatic pivoting? How do we lead the church in the biggest crisis our nation has faced in our lifetimes, with the possibility of 25% unemployment, or maybe in some places 85%, with our parishioners who are either super busy or completely out of work? This is the time that we will remember for the rest of our lives, looking back on it and saying, here was a changing point in our lifetimes and in our leadership. What does it mean to be faithful? Not just to rescue the church, but to help the church step up to the plate and do the ministry that God calls us to do. So that's the conversation that Catherine and Joe and I really are wanting to have. And we'd like to invite the folks online to join us, to add your comments. We're hoping, as I said, that this is like cross-country checkup. We will spark some conversation, and we'll collect as many good ideas as we can, because heaven knows Joe and Catherine and I don't have a corner on the truth. We are that. Before we jump into it, folks?
A couple of things. One is that this is the biggest shared crisis that we have participated in our lifetimes. And part of what makes it so awe-inspiring, frankly, is that we do share it with people across the world. And we share the political questions and all of that. Many of us have been through crises that have been life-threatening, terrifying, very personal, or very communally oriented. And I think we often learn from that, not only how we are going to respond, but we have a spiritual maturity that doesn't necessarily, but can happen. And for me, that takes away a little bit of the immensity of this whole thing, which is to think, when I look out at my neighborhood, I know that a number of my neighbors have been through extraordinary things, and now we're going through this together. And that strengthens me to know of that. I spent Saturday morning at Temple Beth Ora at Sabbath prayers, and then teaching about Miriam, and the sense of what that Jewish community had been through in their recent history was strengthening, because they know how to be faithful community in a time of crisis.
Thanks, that's really helpful. You remind me that we're not living in one crisis. We're living in millions of individual crises. Everyone has a story, and everyone is being affected by this in different ways. And we have some shared experience, and for each person it's unique. So that's a really helpful reminder. Thanks. Joe, what are you thinking about as we kind of set the stage here?
Oh man, lots of ideas swirling around, but just to build on what you've said so far, I do think that, we have so many churches that were kind of in a survival mode before we were facing this challenge within our communities, within our neighborhoods, within our world. but that survival, I think the question behind the survival question was, what's our purpose anyway? Like, I mean, what's the point in surviving, really? For some churches, where it wasn't, I think some congregations didn't have a clear sense of what is their purpose. And I think that this situation is really driving that reflection for what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing among some of my colleagues, is that question has kind of a fresh voice. Like, so what's our role in this? And so in the current congregation that I'm serving, we're doing some open space and some World Cafe. It's an interim period, so we're doing some of that kind of reflection. And I kept, I was talking about partnerships. We need to think about who in the neighborhood do we partner with, and there was some interest in that, but it was difficult for me to find some traction for that. And then now we're in this situation, and as Catherine says, this is a shared thing. This is a human issue. So this is a human problem. It's a human crisis. It's a human challenge. And so suddenly we are, this congregation is talking to the public health unit and to the municipality and to the city and so on. And we're saying, how could we use our space in a way that is going to contribute to mitigating some of the challenges that we are all facing together in this neighborhood, in this community, in the city. And it is very much now, raising up the sense of purpose for one thing, but also a sense of connectivity with within our own neighborhood. And so it's definitely, it's interesting that this, in some way, this is kind of raising at least one congregation out of any kind of sense of survival and more into a sense of calling, discipleship, and purpose. It's been interesting to watch that happening.
I've been chairing a group from Edmonton Presbytery now through Northern Spirit Region, and it reaches back for 40 years, and it's about new ministry development. So this particular group has the funds that have come from the sale of some churches in future generations, and their trust to the future church, which is us, to put that money into ministry development. And so the longtime question of this group has been, when a congregation comes with a request for funds, what are they really looking for? Is it about keeping a neighborhood church open? Is it about worry about rentals drying up? Is it a social justice initiative? Does it have to do with keeping the particular church community together, or is it about making some kind of a neighborhood hub? And all of those are good things. But the question in all of it is, what does that mean for church, for the body of Christ? Why would this be a Christian and particularly United Church endeavor instead of something that a community league could do? Community leagues in our city are very strong. They do all kinds of great things. And often the conversations are not easy in trying to define why it is that having a community hub space that would be open for rentals is important. And now, of course, that has all dried up. But questions about social justice needs in the city, which are many and visceral. But we do social justice because we are the body of Christ. And now we can't be doing so much social justice because volunteers aren't permitted to show up. What we can do is fund the professionals who are running the food banks and so on. But it gives us time to be thinking then, since we aren't able to be the ones out doing the things, why? What is the purpose in faith for these things that we cherish so much, that are vitally important? What is the question of faith? So it's about the mission of the church. And Joe summed it up really well when he was saying, how can we be faithful? How can we be faithful in this time? And a good part of this time is looking toward the immediate and the medium term future. How can we be faithful in this time so that in the autumn and the fall and the next couple of years, what we're doing is grounded in a sense of the risen Christ, rather than a sense of relief that the thing is over, or overjoy because the rentals are back.
Yeah.
So
let me ask the folks online then.
Yeah, good plan.
What kind of spiritual and religious needs are you identifying right now in your region, in your city, in your congregation, in your neighborhood? There may be social justice needs, there may be community outreach needs, but what are the religious needs that only people of faith can address? What are you noticing? And has that changed since the middle of March? Or is it the same as it was in January? But I think sometimes before we can even start to figure out what we may be called to do, it helps to think about what do people need, and where are they at? So what do you think? Put some notes in the chat there, and we'll just kind of collect your thoughts and riff on them for a bit. Peter says, hope is the word that keeps weaving itself through most of the conversations I'm having. Hope for what is an interesting question. Are we just hoping that this is all going to go away? Are we hoping for a magical cure? What do we hope for as Christians? And Sangren is saying relationship with God and our neighbors. Yeah. Need for community beyond isolation, says Keith. Partly I'm reading these aloud because the folks on YouTube don't see the chat, and neither do the people watching the recording. So forgive me for repeating what you've written, but that's why I'm doing it. So meaningful worship, says Diane, connection with others in faith, and Vela adds specifically feelings of isolation, ramping up contact with people. Maria says, people are becoming aware of their interdependence, being community, connection in isolation. They're going too fast now, I can't even name the names. People who've never come out to church are tuning in online. There's a real strong sense of connection running through all of these comments.
Certainly, I think that what's become at least demonstrated in some of the things that have been happening in my context is the importance that our spirituality in our practice of our spirituality is very communal, and it happens in community. It involves relationships with each other. We grow and we understand ourselves and we understand God in connection with one another. And that when that is challenged and the capacity to be able to engage that is challenged, on the one hand, it makes us more conscious of how important that is. And on the other hand, it makes it even more obvious when it can and does happen. So when we've been doing these worship services on Sunday morning using this platform, which allows for engagement of people. And so at the beginning and at the end and sometimes in the middle is this opportunity to either in small breakout rooms or as a whole for people to engage with each other. And they're just so excited to see each other and to connect with each other. And in these small breakout rooms to have to go a little deeper in their conversation rather than just how are you doing and did you get to the grocery store or not. It's an opportunity to meet with other people of faith in those small groups and to connect in that way. It's just been kind of interesting to see how obviously relational our understanding of spirituality is. As I think pretty generally in the United Church, but I'm certainly seeing that in my own context right now. Yeah.
What are you noticing here, Catherine?
Well, I want to say out of what Joe is saying that the relational is so appropriate right now as we're, on Maundy, Thursday, and Jesus is going to sit with his closest friends. We have the incarnation here, and we ourselves are incarnated beings. We are carnate, we are in the flesh. And it's a huge Trinitarian thing of the movement, the flow of relationship, which is the essence of who God is this flow of relationship. And we are finding this great yearning for it. When I drove into the neighborhood where my church is, I saw one of the young families and stopped the car and took off my sunglasses and had this great conversation with a 5-year-old. And I love Hugh, and I know he loves me. And I know that when he plays cars and trucks and construction, he puts me in one of the tractors. He's got a doll.
Oh, I love it.
So yeah, it's darling. But I just, it made my heart sing for the rest of the day that I had seen 5-year-old Hugh and his family. We yearn for these connections. And oddly, that was a face-to-face. I was so excited because it was real face-to-face. And this is great with you. There is an intimacy in these platforms that is also both appalling and enlightening. The depth of questions that people can have in a breakout room that they might or might not ask over church coffee in the friendship room outside. They might, but they might not, because they've got 5 minutes or 20 minutes together online. And although they might know if the person would be at church next Sunday, there's an immediacy to the need to ask, how is it with your transitioning child? How is it with your dying parent? How is it with your illness? How is it with your skiing? There's an immediacy to it.
There's not a lot of trivial chit chat these days.
Not a lot of trivial chit chat.
People are going right to the heart of things. I notice in the conversations I'm having. Yeah. We don't stay on the surface nearly as much as we often do in, say, coffee hour.
That's right. That's right. And so
another
role,
thing.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
Well, my role in as the ordained minister in place to equip the saints, there's a new level of intensity to that. When I'm preaching Palm Sunday at my gate, because it's a pivotal moment when Jesus comes in and my gate pivots, and I'm talking about this pivotal time, it's a very intimate, intense, short sermon that isn't the same as the Sunday morning chancel. And I know that I am larger than life in this format. I'm also aware that people don't look away as much. And so in terms of my role in equipping the saints, there are some differences there. And I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on that now or a little later in our time together.
Sure. Well, and we're going to talk about worship in a bit, I think, and the intimacy of this platform, I think, changes
equipping
worship,
the saints
right?
part.
Yeah, and equipping the saints, I think, is maybe always part of what the church is for, right? That is always certainly the job of ministers, but maybe to the job of churches, equipping the saints so that we can go out and be disciples. Not so that we can be churches, not so we can be churchy, but so we can go out and be disciples, and that we gather together to be nurtured by that.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering about the whole notion of sanctuary. And this is something I've been talking about with my parishioners for, maybe 6 or 8 months now. All kinds of people come to my church and they tell me part of what they like is to have an hour a week where they don't have to think about the frenzy of life, where they don't have to worry about the trivialities of life or the anxieties of life. They can find some time to carve out space. And I think that's really at its root what sanctuary is about. And I'm wondering if that's just getting amplified by the anxiety in our society right now, this need for sanctuary and a spiritual sanctuary, where we do it in the presence not only of each other, but of God.
Certainly the whole idea of space is rethought, in the whole concept of physical distancing or social distancing, it speaks to our notion of just the concept of sharing space with other people. I know that we have men's and women's and study groups in this congregation where I'm serving. And so the 4 men's groups have wanted to continue to share space in some way. And I find that part of my role in equipping them to do that is to hold space for them, which, part of my work as a consultant is with a project that we called Hosting Sacred Conversations, which is, the art of hosting. And that's all about holding space, for people to engage in conversations that matter with each other. And I found that there's been that's been part of my role these last few weeks is to hold space for people. And because by setting the context for the conversation that happens, but also to be in that conversation in a hosting capacity to not direct that conversation, but to ask the kinds of questions that create an openness to that conversation and to that space. So that's, in some ways, has been, I think, an equipping function.
I love the notion of minister as host. That's an image I've not thought about for a long time. But I wonder whether others online or you, Catherine, are thinking about different images for ministry. What's our role now? What are we supposed to be doing with the people who are looking to us? And are we, I mean, partly we are the host of the party, the host of the conversation, the host that allows people to go deeper and not stay on the surface. What other images for ministry are helpful here? And folks online too. I mean, I'm not just asking the experts, but what is coming to mind for you as you imagine your way into your role right now?
I want to say I'm enjoying the chat. I'm listening to
It's fun, isn't
Joe
it?
and enjoying the chat because this is a conversation of peers. We all have different experiences of this, and we all have wisdom and expertise and questions, and it's wonderful to be able to gather as colleagues. It's always been part of my practice of ministry to have deep collegial relationships across the denomination and beyond the denomination, and not just in terms of coming up with strategies and nifty ideas, because that's part of it, but that sense of being in this vocation together, holding one another in prayer and love and humor and those things. And I love the concept of holding space, Joe, and moving that into this more metaphorical sense of holding space in the relationships, the intimate relationships that happen online. What a great host does is welcome people and then put people in positions at the dining table or in the living room or in the restaurant where they'll talk with someone and there will be mutuality and then curiosity. And, we've been told as leaders in essential services that we need to be 2 steps ahead of what's happening. So we're catching up in our own emotional and physical lives and then being prepared for the church. But as a host, your beautiful phrase, as a host, we get to think now, who in this party, who in my congregation needs to be connected with somebody other than me? I'm working through the congregational list, and I will have been in touch with everybody in some form over the next while. But it's not all about me. So where are there places to connect people? And we have a church full of leaders. If I define St. Paul's, it's a church of leaders. So which leaders could be doing something a little bit different? And I ask a question and somebody comes up with an idea and then they run with it. So I think that's a part of it. Being in the position to ask the question, to make an invitation, would you like to think about doing something of this nature? And then finding others to work on that. Because I have the pleasure of knowing my congregation, for the most part, very well after all these years. And so I can connect people. And I can also call people generally say yes when I ask them to do something. Almost always say yes.
Oh, that's the power of the clerical color, isn't it?
Well, I could think it was that, but I also think really carefully before I call. And why would this person want to do this thing? One choir director who said, well, that's a good idea. I could direct the choir. I'll do it until it's no longer fun. Well, that's a great reason to be a choir director because you're going to enjoy it. So I think the host idea knowing the people in different ways than they know one another. Not always better ways, but different ways. And figuring out who's going to sit beside each other and who can do something. And then saying, great, God bless you. Another part about being a host is people show up at your party because you've invited them, which probably means you like them. And in the church, it ought to mean that we love them.
Mhm.
And so to be able to say that very clearly right now, I love you, God loves you, God bless you, peace of Christ, all those big sentences that are very intimate. Very intimate. And one of the pleasures of it is that in order to love people, you don't actually have to like them.
Okay, that was an evil laugh.
No, I think it's true in all of our relationships.
What I'm loving about this conversation is that so many of us who've gone through seminary and lead churches are doers. We want to know what's our task list and what do we have to do next. And the images coming up on the screen, some of them are very doer stuff. We're supposed to be the spiritual carer. We're supposed to be the shepherd. We're the one that everybody looks to. And this notion of host means that we're kind of encouraging, we're equipping the saints, is what we're doing, to use your earlier image.
Yeah.
That we're kind of managing, planting seeds, connecting people, and then allowing God to do the work, which is a whole lot easier to do.
Mm-hmm.
One
We also then
person-
remind them why we're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Joe.
Say some more. Oh, okay. Yeah, you go ahead, Joe. You haven't talked for a minute.
I think it might be along the same line if I caught that. One person, I don't know whose Sungren is the login name, but said when we were asking kind of what are our images of the role of leadership and ministry, an enlightener to finding out and shaping who we are with and within God. And it may not be exactly what they're saying, but it reminded me that I think one of our roles as theologians and as ministry leaders is interpretation. It's to try and make sense. It has something to do with sense making, and I think a lot of our people within our congregations, but just people in the world generally, are trying to make sense of what's happening. And that, age-old question, where is God in this, is a really important question, I think, on people's minds. And so part of our role is in some ways to, not necessarily to have, well, probably not at all to have an answer to those questions, but to help sit with those questions, because we have the capacity in our role and in our education and experience to do that, to help people sit with those really important questions. And out of those questions, there is then some sense making, to try and come to terms to some degree with, and to be essentially to accept. I'm trying to think of something I was reading recently about that a part of faithfulness is accepting what is. That's kind of the beginning point of anything, is to accept it. Is that sense of acceptance of what is, and from there to try and wrestle with that in terms of our faith and in our understanding.
So let me get more specific, because I think this is, I couldn't agree more. I think part of what draws people to churches is a way to put meaning into life and to connect with something bigger than ourselves. So here we are coming into the holiest weekend of the year. We're coming into Good Friday and Easter. We're starting with Maundy Thursday tonight. How do these ancient stories speak to our time this weekend?
Mm-hmm.
It couldn't be better.
Yeah. Say some more.
Couldn't be better, because we start this year, it's John's Gospel, so it couldn't be better. So first of all, we've got God dying, so God has been here. And in John's Gospel, Jesus carries his own cross. He is in control. Caroline Lewis writes beautifully. Her book on John is the best thing I have ever read, and I studied with a John scholar at Harvard, and Caroline Lewis is just top drawer. Anyway, she's a Lutheran elsewhere. Her book is relatively new. So I'm Caroline Lewis on John. Jesus is in control. He's not simply the human being. He is God going to be crucified. So God has been here in the anticipation and in the pain itself and in the death. It's absolutely essential. And we're waiting, aren't we, for the curve? We're waiting. The physicians I talk with say, the hospitals are still empty. We are waiting, but we know it's coming. So there's that part of it that's coming. And then also, bless John's pointed little head, we've got this wonderful story of Mary Magdalene, and she goes to the disciples and so on. But, that day, the world didn't change. People were scared. They were still isolated. They ran away to Emmaus. They, it wasn't, it was transformative, but it wasn't all of a sudden things are good. And so we get to walk through Good Friday, knowing that God has been there, has died, and into Easter, into the resurrection. And we're going to be living the rest of this pandemic in the resurrected season, as bit by bit, the presence of Christ becomes, the risen Christ becomes more real. It's just like, if this had happened in winter, it would have been terrible because of the weather and the darkness. But happening, through Lent and Easter, it just gives all this opportunity for leadership and reflection. And as you say, Joe, interpretation. And we offer those questions to people. I mean, I get to preach a sermon because that's what I do, but I'm preaching the sermon aware that I don't expect people to agree with me, or I expect to be able to give them some ideas that they're going to work away with. And some people will say, oh, that Catherine, she's absolutely right. But, for the most part, people are going to go away and think about ideas and work about it in their own faith. But holy smoke, these are the ideas I get to present this weekend. And I get to do it in people's homes, because they're going to be sitting having their morning coffee, listening to the tenor, and then listening to somebody else who is very ill, reading the scripture passage about Mary. And then I get to sit there with them at their coffee table and up front and center, talk about how this Easter is a quiet little secret thing. Okay, enough. But isn't that brilliant that we get to do it now?
It's remarkable. I agree. So Joe, riff on that. Where are you at with this?
Oh, wow. I'm still
not to put you on the spot or anything.
Observing what Catherine, I agree. I mean, this is the time that we are speaking our theology in a way that is just so apropos. I mean, this is the word, this is the gospel, right? That we need to hear. John, it couldn't be better that it's John, because Jesus is no hapless victim in that gospel. Like Jesus knows exactly what the plan is and what it means and where it's going. And so that sense of a God who is, the answer to the question then, where's God in this? Well, God's right here. Like God is in this. God is present in the midst of what this is all about. So yeah.
So we're kind of moving towards worship leadership, and that's the direction we were going to go anyway in our outline. As you're thinking your way into worship this weekend, we've already mentioned a few times about the intimacy of these kinds of meetings. Catherine said that she gets to preach in people's homes. I remember Matt Galloway, who now leads The Current on CBC Radio. He used to be on CBC Toronto. Talked about the intimacy of radio, that he's speaking 2 inches away from the microphone, so he's whispering into our ears, which is a wonderful image. And I have a sense when we're doing these kinds of webinars or when we're doing this kind of worship that we're doing the same thing. It is so much more intimate than anything we're used to doing. how does that change worship for you? And let me throw it to Joe first, because Catherine just would give you a chance to breathe after that wonderful sermon on John.
Yeah, I think it's a very different very different way to be present with people, through the medium, the media that we currently have. And yeah, I love that idea of whispering into, as a radio host, whispering into people's ears. I do find it's a very different, there's a more relaxed sense. So you can, your guard is down a little bit in a way, even though it's a new technology and people are connecting in ways that are maybe not comfortable or familiar, and they're fussing with trying to get their microphone to come on, or their video and so on. But there's still this sense of, we're in our homes. We had communion last week, Palm Sunday, and people just, it was, the invitation was to whatever you've got. You may have drunk your last bottle of wine already. So, you may have to use, orange juice or something like that to, because it's all you got. So it was a sense of people in the comfort of their own space, and that people let their guard down a little bit, I think, or might let their guard down a little bit. Mm-hmm. So it does create a very different space for us to gather, and have these conversations. Anyway, I'll stop talking there because I wanted to look something up that I'm.
Sure. So Catherine, how is worship changing for you in the middle of this?
Well, I think looking for the connecting points and the questions is always an enlivening thing. And so what are the different kinds of images right now? And so I just want to go back to Palm Sunday and the gate. We couldn't do Palm Sunday. The Catholic bookstore that has a perennial order for us was closed. We couldn't even get the palms. And so we asked people if they would send a short video of waving a branch or something, which worked out just beautifully because people were connected. But I looked and thought, okay, what's the part of this that I can do in a really short sermon? And that's where I went to the gate, because Jesus came through the gate. It was a pivotal time, but it was just that image of the gate. And so I think in this time where it's more intimate, there are tinier pieces that are so visible. Last night when I was recording the Good Friday service, I thought, I've already, moved to just this much of the John story, but for a video, it's still too long. And, so I was looking at it and thinking, of course, it's all important. But what can I take in if I'm watching a video? How many words? And if it's going to be happening frequently, how many words? So what are the fresh, sparkling, different, odd things that I've never seen before? Because I know that it's not going to be in the church chancel. It's going to be at somebody's kitchen table. What's different? So somehow the donkey and the colt thing just didn't seem as relevant. It's great, but didn't seem as relevant as just this idea of an open gate in a pivot.
Well, and you were telling us on Tuesday about a video that you saw that a Lutheran pastor had made about preparing for a home communion. We'll put a link to that onto the recording page, but tell us a little bit about that, because here Sungren is asking, how do we transform our secularized spaces into sacred spaces? And that's exactly what she's talking about. So
it's a beautiful video. Yeah, Sungren, have a look at it. It's just so beautifully done. But when I go and do home communion with someone, I have this lovely little, you've probably given one at ordination, a little suitcase that you open up, and it's got a couple of cups and something to put the bread on. And so I set the table right in the hospital room or the nursing home. I set the table with those things. I bring a cloth. And so this beautiful video speaks of preparing your home. Find a tablecloth that's clean and fresh over maybe there is a plate that you've never used before. Maybe it was given to you by somebody and you've never used it before, or maybe it's the one that you use all the time, but choose carefully the items that you're going to use. And as Joe says, with the elements, you know, it might be the orange juice, but think about what it is that you're going to use, and acknowledge that we are transforming ordinary things into extraordinary things. And so it is special. It is a sacrament. It's not an ordinary thing anymore because it's being transformed. And so setting up the space, gathering the people you're living with, moving through the prayer. When we offer communion in our congregation, which we haven't done yet, but when we do, there'll be quite a bit of interesting conversation with the worship committee and then with the congregation. But one of the things I'm aware of are the people who are not online. And so it's my intention to send them the service ahead of time so that they can read with us in synchronous time, even though they won't have the computer. And lots of people don't have access for economic reasons.
So your folks are not even connecting just by telephone then?
Some won't be. Some won't be because they're disabled, or they are in they are not able to hear anymore. There's a number of reasons why that. So anyway, it opens up room, Steve, for a different medium. So if some of us are on Zoom and some are on the phone and some have the paper copy, that'll be a way of doing it. But the video does speak of making our ordinary space extraordinary. And when we go into the church and we see the chancel dressed for communion, whether it's simple or extravagant, we know in that sanctuary place, something remarkable is happening. So we do that in our own homes. And, you know, then, oh my gosh, the sense the next time you walk into the dining room, or you light that candle, or you lift that plate down or put it out of the dishwasher, you know, it's going to go on and on.
I have been watching on commercial television stories about clergy who are running worship services to empty sanctuaries, all dressed up in their vestments and you know, doing the sanctuary thing. And for me, it rings completely hollow. It feels like a show. Whereas doing what you're talking about, creating the sacred place within our homes, feels deeply authentic. I guess that's really what I'm longing for in this time. I don't want to welcome people into the show. I want to say God is in your house.
Yep. Oh, that authenticity is the whole thing. And Joe, you've been very careful of pointing out that we're all doing this in our own places. And it's all different. All of this is a different incarnation, different people, different communities. So it needs to be authentic for that. And there is a spiritual authenticity in that. Steve, you're right. And the first number of worship videos that we recorded, we did in the chancel. And now we're doing them from our homes. It's different. I'm actually doing the Easter sermon in the chancel because I have heard from my people. I've heard from the people I serve and love that there are images they miss, that there's a large painting in the chancel that has always drawn people together. And so that's where I'm going to preach from, because I have heard from them that they miss that so much. I'm not going to do that the week following, but because it's Easter, I'm going to take them there in that format. It will be and it'll only be part. The rest of the service will all be from different places.
Well, and given that you're recording this, pre-recording it, it's easier to jump around from different places.
Right.
Much harder if you're doing something live streamed the way that we are today.
Yeah.
What about you, Joe? What's worship like for your congregation, and how are you responding to this need for intimacy?
Well, I think that it's maybe a little aside of your question. I feel like when a politician who, no matter what question you ask them, they're going to have the answer that they want to.
You got the answer you want to say. You go ahead. You're wise anyway.
One of the things I was thinking about this morning was how important it is for congregations, and the reason I'm piggybacking on what something Catherine has said about being authentic, and that sense of authenticity. There is, I think, a temptation right now for us to try to do something. We're having to adapt, which means trying to do different things, which can be good. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. It's causing us to be inventive and creative and adapt, and that can be good. And because some of those innovations will find their way into the years to come in some ways. But at the same time, to be innovative in a way that is not authentic to who you are as a congregation is probably not a good thing. But I think that one of the important things to lift up right now is, for whatever we do and however we do it, I think it needs to be authentic to the culture and the theology and the practices of the congregation, the community of faith. So if it is your practice to have a very rich but traditional, classical, sort of experience of worship, and that's what the community values, then the question is, how can you still maintain that, or to celebrate that, or to be that? If you remember the book by Diana Butler Bass that was called The Practicing Congregation. And she looked at 10 congregations, and each of them had a practice that was, the practice might have been hospitality, or the practice might have been prayer, or the practice might have been worship. And that was the core practice of the congregations, and they were all different. And I think in this time, I think a reminder to us is, no matter how inventive or how much adapting we do, let's take the pause and take the time to ask ourselves the question: what is the core value or the core practice of this community of faith, and how can we draw upon that strength in this time? Because those are strengths, our practices as congregations can be great strengths. And so don't abandon the strength, I think, is an important thing. So when I think about the worship, I think of it in that context as well, that the worship in some ways can't leave behind what is the strength of that community.
I think that's so helpful. And it goes beyond Sunday worship. I think part of what this pandemic is pushing me to think about is what are all the different things that I do, what are they for? What's the purpose behind them? Should I just keep doing the same things I've always done as a minister? Or do I need to do it differently because it has a different impact in this time because of where I'm doing it from? I mean, we've been talking about that in terms of worship and how worship maybe feels more intimate, or because the medium is. But I'm wondering too about funerals and weddings and other sacramental kinds of rituals. I mean, part of our role within the community is to preside at ritual. And ritual is part of meaning making. It's how human beings make meaning. I'm doing my first online funeral next week. I haven't done one yet. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. I'm sort of inventing, but it's making me stop and think about, what's a funeral for? Why do we do this? And what are the pieces that I need to make sure we incorporate or do in some other way so that it has the spiritual and psychological impact it's supposed to have? What are your thoughts about these other kinds of, I mean, I know they're not sacraments in our tradition, but these other sacramental rituals that we do at the turning points of people's lives that we still need to be able to do. We're going to be doing this for months. We're all going to have funerals between now and then. We're coming into wedding season. I mean, how are we going to respond to this? And not just the how-to, but the why. What do we think we're doing? What's this about?
And another one, Steve, is confirmation. Confirmation programs that started during Lent, perhaps, or that leaders have prepared for the Easter season. Do we put that on hold, or do we continue? I think so much of these questions comes into the nature of the community, for sure. Why does this couple wish to be married now instead of postponing? There are lots of good reasons for both. Will the family have a graveside service and a burial, and then a memorial service later? What would that mean for them? But in terms of the presider, the sense of equipping the saints and being the one who is offering into the variety of questions, the spiritual questions, being able to probe for meaning with those families without sounding judgmental, without saying I have an answer or my church has an answer. But what is it to be able to ask the questions gently in an appreciative style, so that the decision that's made is one that people feel is appropriate, and they might not make the same decision for the next one. For things like confirmation, gosh, it could be quite remarkable given the intimacy that we've been talking about that happens in this medium. And certainly if we're talking about teenagers, this is a medium that some youth groups are finding very lively and very generative, very comfortable. And then it's drawing things out that might not happen sitting in a room at the church.
Joe, do you want to add to that?
No.
That's fair. Let me,
I'll add
yeah, go ahead.
If I might, and that is that as much as funerals became memorial services, became celebrations of life, there still is a theology of funerals that we do need to be able to bring into conversations that have to do with offering to God the life of this person, which is beyond eulogizing and beyond a large gathering over coffee. It's beyond a wake. It's that religious letting God take this person. And I think that's something that we need to be able to bring into the conversation with funerals, that is in addition to everything else I'd said about asking gentle questions of the family.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to hold up a couple of comments in the chat here, and then I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about pastoral care and outreach. But just before we leave the whole worship conversation, Keith is acknowledging that homes are more of a challenge with families including young children, because it's noisy and mm-hmm. It's quiet is part of what we appreciate in worship. I get that. Who is it here? Carolyn is talking about how she's recording her sermons, but then she has a partner who's inserting videos and various other things, and she's having a lot of fun. And fun is not a word we've mentioned. And you know what? I think fun is where it's at. I think we need to get over the panic and the adrenaline and figure out what's fun, because laughter is a sign of the presence of God. So thank you for that, Catherine. That really jumped out at me. Janet's talking about how the first Easter morning was not a triumphant holy day, which it goes back to some of what you were saying, Catherine, about that too. Like, it was a time of a tiny little vulnerable seed that was maybe turning things around, but mostly they were still terrified. And that may change how we talk about Easter this week. I mean, there's a huge journey between Easter and Pentecost. And the triumphant day really is Pentecost, I think. And this gradual dawning awareness that what they saw on Easter Sunday was real and not just a mirage. So I think that journey that we'll go through over the great 50 days is going to be luminous. And so, Janet, thank you for naming that. And then Paula, who's kind of picking up a comment you made, Joe, earlier, she says, in this webinar last week, someone gave us the reminder that we're in the middle of online worship, not to build an audience, but to build relationships. I was talking to somebody the other day who was saying they were so enjoying Sunday morning because they were skipping about from one worship service to the next and maybe taking in 6 or 7 different colleagues to see how they preached. And I thought, okay, so you're sampling the smorgasbord. But that's not what worship is for me. and I think you're absolutely right, Paula. How do we turn people or encourage people or invite people into being in relationship and not just being viewers?
I'm in my situation, I'm not the primary liturgist or preacher. I work with Bill Smith. We're both in an interim, a 1-year interim capacity with this congregation. And we had a guest lined up. It was a a service that the United Church Women were going to be organizing, and they had a guest coming. And so they had to struggle with the question, do we want to bring a guest in and incorporate them somehow into this online format of worship or not? Do we want to continue with the planned, UCW service or not? And they decided no. But the reason was because of the relationship that they have with the preacher, in this case, Bill Smith. And they said, right now we need to be together with Bill on Sunday morning. This isn't the time to carry on as usual and do our planned guest speaker service. It's the time to sit down in a worship experience with our pastor. It was kind of their response to that, which I thought was telling. It spoke to that whole idea that right now those relationships are that have been created matter to people.
And maybe that's why it's a good thing you're not going on sabbatical, Catherine.
Well, that's
right
why
now is not the time.
You're exactly right. I was due to go on sabbatical beginning the 21st of April, and I guess 2.5 weeks ago now, I called up my ministry and personnel liaison and said, let's talk about modifying this. And so it's a modified one. It's not a postponement. And we will work, ministry and personnel and me, together on how that's going to work. The worship committee had 19 Sundays all figured out. We've got pastoral care, all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was ready to go. But to be present with the people in that relationship, we know each other really well. And someone in the chat used the word trust. I think it was Marilyn. And in my humble opinion, trust is the essential thing in equipping the saints in the vocation. It's trust. And some congregations are more trusting, but it's always something we earn, and it grows, and it goes both ways. We learn to trust the congregation too. And none of us are infallible. We make mistakes, and we need to be able to apologize, but that's part of deepening trust. So I know that there is a trust and in the relationship that we can be together in these next few weeks. And, we'll figure out the sabbatical. I can read books and research and go to conferences till I retire. There's lots of stuff to do. That's quite all right. And part of the sabbatical thing is it's a privilege. And so we're reshaping it. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of a segue, I guess, into away from the worship side of it.
And I wanted to segue away, and I'm also aware that it is Maundy, Thursday, and we may want to draw this to a close a little sooner. I noticed that the numbers are going down a little bit, and that's not because you guys aren't riveting. It's just because this is that weekend. So
one thing, Steve, about the Facebook experience, and that's the commodification of worship, the commodification of the leader of worship, and that is quite distasteful. But I think that's part of what we see in that objectifying of being able to attend 8 worship services in a morning.
Yeah, it's not worship for me then. When I have no desire to do that. Let me just sort of be clear about that. Yeah. Not that I don't like my colleagues, but by the time I'm done, I'm ready to think about something else. Well, okay, so in the last, go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
Participation. You can be a participant in an experience and never actually say anything. Like I believe that when we gather in worship on Sunday morning, you can also have that as a very passive form of entertainment. True. As well. I mean, that can happen as well. But ultimately, that's not what feeds my soul. What feeds my soul is if I'm an active participant. And I may never speak, I may not even sing the hymns, but I'm still engaged with the people around me and with the preacher and with the choir and so on. I'm engaged, I'm a part of something. And I just think that that's, for most of us, that's what we still are trying to create in this current context, is that.
Well, and I think it's quite possible, and the person who was talking to me about it was I think, engaged in each of those 8 worship services. I'm terrific. Gosh, I don't have the attention span, but for her, that was luminous. And so I wouldn't want to denigrate
No,
that.
no, I'm not.
But it does need, I agree with you that as worship leaders, we need to be encouraging the kind of engagement you're talking about.
Yeah, I wasn't really speaking to that particular example, but more reflecting what Catherine had said about that, about the Facebook experience,
Sure.
Yeah.
So let me pivot for the last few minutes, and we may finish a few minutes early, and that's just fine. Worship isn't the only thing we do as church leaders. We are also involved in pastoral care. We're also involved in outreach. We're also involved in teaching. What other kinds of things do we need to be doing in this time, in the great 50 days, in the next 3 months while we're self-isolating, to help our congregations be the church when we're not doing the rituals and the holy magics? What's our role, and what kinds of things should we be pondering as we move into this and live into the new normal instead of into the emergency?
One of the things that I'm beginning to learn, is how to pray with people online. I always offer a prayer when I'm visiting. It's one of the things that makes it a pastoral visit, is to offer prayer. People don't always say yes, but they usually do. It's different leading online worship and praying. It's still, but to be in a FaceTime or a Zoom visit with someone and pray is kind of like, what do I do with my eyes? Am I going to forget the Lord's Prayer? I'm going to forget the words in the Lord's Prayer. It's just, so that's a learning. And that's part of the pastoring.
I guess what I was saying earlier about congregations being authentic to their own practices, like I could see a congregation saying, you know what, folks, I'm not, worship isn't the strongest thing we do together. We're a praying congregation. So you folks go and look online and watch the moderator's worship service, do that kind of stuff on Sunday morning, and that's good. But every day I'm going to be here on this Zoom call to pray with you, like that might be their practice, and they need to feel okay about that, or maybe that their practice is hospitality. And so they say, we're going to really rally around to make sure that, folks have what they need in terms of eating and drinking and being, having phone calls made to them. So we're going to phone people like crazy, but worship and praying, no, that's not what we're going to be doing right now, because it's not who we are, So that kind of sense of, in this sense, Steve, as we sort of segue into pastoral care and outreach and so on, I guess I just want to underline that this is a time for communities of faith to really ask themselves that question and to become even clearer about it, to say, okay, we can only do so much. Where are we going to put our energy in the energy it takes to adapt? Because I'm finding that I'm spending twice as much time doing what I normally do, because it has to be adapted, so you're only going to have so many resources and so much energy to do that. Mm-hmm. You really have to think about what matters, and I think it's an important time for congregations to ask themselves that question, of communities of faith, to say, what really does matter to us, and
so what matters to you, Catherine? I think Joe's question is important for all of us.
I think it's very important, and I think as the called leaders, it's we get to look around and say, all right, this has been the strength of the congregation. Let's have a conversation with the board or with the worship committee or with the outreach committee about why we do these things and what that means. If we're not actually able as volunteers to be out there doing it, because volunteers aren't permitted in the food security place, if we have to be funding the professionals to do that, then we have to do something about generosity and donations, figure out how to do that. But to have those conversations about what is the nature of church? Why do we do these things? Is this going to be our defining character when we come back, or will our character have adapted a little bit? What does that mean? We can have those conversations with the leadership right now because we have online meeting time, and the understanding, the reality that this really is the marathon is beginning to sink in for most of us. So we can schedule a meeting in 2 weeks after Easter to talk about why do we have food security in our church? Not how are we going to do it, but what
Mhm.
does it mean? Or the other parts of the outreach that we do.
Folks online, what are you doing in your churches about outreach? What is our calling right now? What's happening in your congregations, the ones that you lead? I love the idea of sharing space, Joe, with one of the community groups you're talking about, and how all of a sudden this pandemic has made that a more live issue for folks.
We have been sharing space with the seniors association for their activities, and it's not just sharing space; it's sharing that as a activity together, of you know, our programming together, shared programming essentially. But they're shut down, right? I mean, they're not coming in to do art and music and things like that normally happen in groups in the sanctuary or in the building, the whole building. So it has raised the question, okay, how space is one of the assets that we've had to use in our being part of this neighborhood, this community. How does that change? And so that's what, caused them to go looking and say, what is it that folks, are needing right now? And that's where they're now engaged in a conversation with these other agencies to say, how can we help? How can we be part of that? Yeah, it's that story is still yet to be told, but they're in those conversations right now to see what happens. So.
And there's folks online here who are talking about how some of their local community agencies are also closed down, but others aren't. And so, I mean, Tina's sharing stories of caremongering. Check in by Zoom once a week, share stories, blogs, art, music. Vila's helping organizations through financial means, raising monies, contributing to the food pantry in our community, says Rolanda. Did a drive-through food drive, says Lori. Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
Our food banks in Toronto are crying, just crying for donations. The need has doubled, and they can't use the same volunteers. They're pre-packaging all the food in bags and then just handing them out the door. But their clientele has doubled.
Someone mentioned making, now that we know that cloth masks can be of some benefit. We have someone mentioned that there are folks that are sewing those or making those, and that's happening at where I serve as well. A group of people are making masks for the health units.
Reminds me of the people during the Second World War who would knit socks for the soldiers. The same kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
My grandmother knit her hair into the sock that she knit for her sweetheart.
Wow.
I want to say something about our vocation and who we are, and that has to do with recovery time. And traditionally, the Sunday after Easter was a low Sunday. In my experience, that's no longer the case. So I have to carve it for myself. That recovery time, it's not my best. Well, I can relax really well, but I'm always aware of what needs to be done. So I assume that is true for others. And, that it does, as you say, Joe, take so much longer to do things that we are doing. And we're tired and we're carrying our own strain. And so to be able to rest after this triduum, 3 days of services is a big honking load any year. And it's supposed to be. And so, to be able to rest, whatever that means, reading, sleeping, napping, walking, playing with the dog, doing puzzles. And I'm thinking that this year, it's an opportunity to talk about that a little more clearly with my congregation, because we're in this together in a different kind of way. They're coming into my home for Maundy Thursday this evening. I'm going to sit in front of the fireplace with the basin and towel. And very few of them have ever been in my home before. So I don't know, maybe I talk about recovery, relaxed time in a more straightforward way. I haven't hidden it from them before, but it's just none of their business. I don't know. I wonder how others are looking at recovery time. You know, how can we keep 2 steps ahead of what's going on and also get the rest that we not only need, but are entitled to?
I think that's a wonderful invitation to people on the chat to and this will probably be the last thing we talk about today because we're coming close to our time. What are you doing to take care of yourself in the middle of this? What are you doing to take care of your family? What are you doing to ensure that you can authentically experience Easter and not just experience the frenzy of leading Easter?
I do want to offer into that knowing that you are doing that as well. I have a sense of it's not just me in an isolated situation, but we are all part of this, part of the
We
body.
are fixers, we clergy. We get into an emergency and the immediate thing we want to do is jump in with all 3 feet. and yeah, we'll run ourselves ragged and get exhausted by Pentecost, and that helps nobody. Doesn't help our congregations, and it sure doesn't help us.
No, that's right. Yeah.
This candle that's been burning behind me, this little candle holder I made on my brand new lathe. This is part of what I'm doing when I'm not thinking about church. I am so inexperienced at this that I cannot think about anything else when I'm doing it. So I'm just having a ball with this thing and wishing I had more time to play with it. But you know, that's part of what's on the schedule for Saturday is to do something else on the lathe. Because I can't think about anything else when I'm doing it.
When this first began, as a musician and singer-songwriter, I thought, well, maybe I'll have more time to play an instrument or to record music or to write music. It's been the last thing, and so I'm really hoping that as kind of things settle into a bit more of a glide here, once we're through Easter, that I'll be able to turn back to my guitar and my recording studio again and start doing some music, because it has a terrible, I get really grouchy if I'm not playing my guitar often enough, so everybody suffers.
I love listening to you play your guitar.
Yes. I want to acknowledge Paula Gale's comment here. She says she has been more exhausted in these weeks than in the busiest weeks of normal time.
Yeah.
And I just think we need to be honest about that and clear about that. All of these new skills that we're learning, it takes energy. And all of the anxiety that we are living with ourselves, but also absorbing from the people we work with, it takes energy. And to give ourselves permission not to be alone in the middle of that is just crucial.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have to break our toes in order to get the rest, Carolyn.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh my friends, you are leading the church through important and dramatic times. God has an important mission for the church and for its leaders. And we are, for good or for ill, called to step up to the plate to help the church take hold of its history and its present and its future. We are called to explore what it means to love our neighbors and to love God and to make meaning in a time when so many people are longing for that. What a privilege. It's exhausting, but what a privilege. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for engaging in this conversation with Catherine and me. Thank you for the leadership you're offering all across the country. As Catherine was pointing out at the beginning, we are not dealing with one national crisis. We are dealing with millions of individual crises that are all happening in tandem. And we are a part of that, and we are ministering to it. And God gives us the grace and the resources to walk through this with people. So thank you, and blessings to each of you as you move into this busy season, as you explore these thoughts and themes of death and resurrection that cut to the heart of where we're at. It's a privilege to be sharing this time with you. Catherine
Thanks.
and Joe, wonderful to work with you. Luminous comments. The time has just flown by, and I'm so grateful that you were able to take the time out of what I know is a busy time for the three of us to help ground us again in our calling, in our vocation, and in what God calls us to do and to be. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
You too. God bless.
Yeah, God bless, friends. I'm going to take Catherine and Joe just into a breakout group so that we can debrief together for 2 or 3 minutes. We'll say goodbye to the rest of you. Next week, we've got the Reverend Sue Browning is coming to talk to us about critical incident theory. What do we need to know in order to manage a crisis? So a little more skills-based training, although Sue is very clear that she is a minister as well as a psychotherapist, and she sees a unique role for clergy in the middle of that. So she is excited to have a chance to share her skills with you, and we'll look forward to welcoming her into this time slot next Thursday afternoon.
It'll be great.
Blessings for now, friends, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.